This is
Oh, that's
something that
great.
I learned in Chicago, that we must have a lot of seminars and webinars. Thank God have given us a new avenue. So we are able to engage people like you and a lot of different people in Pakistan. Today, I'm very happy, and I think all of you will be very happy. We have Professor Michael Spence, the Nobel laureate of 2001, here with us. I think I wouldn't be wrong if I would say that maybe 3 or 4 generations, depending on how you count generations, of economists have had Michael Spence's articles in their microeconomics courses. And all of us know their name very well. All of us know job market signaling. Thank you, Professor Spence, for giving us that. Thank you for introducing imperfect information to us. We are very grateful to you for that. But we are also very grateful to you for chairing the Growth Commission for the last 10 or 15 years. The Growth Commission, ladies and gentlemen, as you know, also is a major commission that was organized by all the international agencies. Professor Spence successfully chaired it. His reports, 2 reports are out there, and their reports are excellent and well worth reading. I'm sure many of you read them. We've used them in the Planning Commission. And I'm sure he'll get to talk to you about them too. So I really am very proud and honored to have Professor Spence here. But for a formal introduction, Professor Spence, I would like Fahad Zulfikar, who managed to get you a young economist, a very bright young economist at PID, to allow him to introduce you formally. Fahad, over to you.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much. Professor Michael Spence is a Philip H. Knight Professor Emeritus of Management in the Graduate School of Business at Stanford University, a senior fellow of the Hoover Institution at Stanford, and a distinguished visiting fellow of the Council on Foreign Relations. In 2001, Professor Spence received the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences for his work in the field of information economics. He's a senior advisor to Jasper Ridge Partners and a senior advisor to General Atlantic Partners. He co-chairs the Advisory Council of the Asia Global Institute and was the chairman of the Independent Commission on Growth and Development. He was awarded the John Kenneth Galbraith Prize for Excellence in Teaching and the John Bates Clark Medal for significant contribution to economic thought and knowledge. He's author of The Next Convergence, The Future of Economic Growth in a Multi-Speed World in 2010. It was published in 2010. He currently co-chairs the Commission on Global Economic Transformation with Joseph Stiglitz. A very big warm welcome to you, sir, and thank you so much for agreeing to do this for us. Thank you.
Thank
So
you,
Professor Michael Spence will talk about the post-pandemic global economy, something that we all are hoping will turn out to be positive and optimistic. Professor Spence, over to you.
Thank you, Fahad, and thank you, Nadeem. It's a pleasure to be with you. So, I mean, this is a kind of ridiculously large topic, but I thought it would be fun to sort of tour around and share thoughts on a number of dimensions. You know, one of the things that fascinated me in the last few years, sort of before I launch into this, is that, you know, the digital technologies, which I'm going to talk a bit about later on, as we're in a kind of major digital transformation, I think most people think, are actually sufficiently powerful now that we are actually affecting the informational structure of markets, and in rather interesting ways. I mean, you know, the starting point of the work that Joe and George Akerlof and I were doing was that there were informational gaps and asymmetries. And at least those aren't disappearing, but there are substantial incursions being made into those things. And so it fascinates me to watch, you know, really for the first time, what you might think of as machine automation and augmentation in a layer of the economy, which doesn't really have a name. I call it information, coordination, and decision-making. And you could add transactions and stuff like that. But anyway, it's a huge amount of economic activity. And you know, in the Industrial Revolution, we introduced machines into the kind of physical side of the economy with enormously big effects on productivity. But, you know, that other layer, which is how we kind of run the place, basically had no industrialization, no machines, powerful machines, and now it does. And so it's kind of fascinating to to try to figure out what's going on. So let me, I thought what I would do today, as I imagine it would be nice to have a conversation. So I'll try to be relatively brief and, leave lots of time for discussion with all of you, because I'd love to hear your insights and viewpoints on many of these things. So I thought I'd talk about recovery patterns, a little bit about vaccines, and, a kind of cascade, what I hope is a cascading sequence of pandemic recoveries, and then a little bit more on what I think of as the post-recovery global economy, how it's going to be different, what things are accelerated, and so on. These, as I say, these are kind of big topics. So I just hauled this out. This is, sorry, I'm going the wrong direction. This is logarithmics set of cases in Pakistan. And it looks to me, Nadim and I were talking about this, it looks to me like you're in pretty good shape. That is, the flatness of that line and means that the growth in total cases is pretty much leveled off. For those of you who are interested, there was a very interesting, one of the things that we've got out of the digital economy is real-time data. And the Luan Academy in Hangzhou in China produced a tracking system, which they call the Pandemic Economy Tracking System. And what it used is this vast trove of mobility data that we get almost on a daily basis from the kind of mobile internet, from Google and a number of other sources. And you could actually see, almost in real time what's going on in the economy. And if you combine that with data from the virus, what you see is the patterns. And you could do this for every country in the world, essentially. So what we saw in the early part of the pandemic was, very rapid spread of the virus. You can see it in that upward slope on your graph. But that was reproduced almost everywhere. And then huge economic contractions. I mean, they varied in magnitude, some were 10%, some were 20, 25%. And then you saw a period of recovery. And the countries that got in trouble are the ones that, were having trouble containing the virus and recovering. So that linkage was very powerful. I mean, you really couldn't engineer any economic recovery until you contained the virus. This is just another graph, so you can see that. This is also, I just took this off the internet from the kind of world of data, but it looks to me like, unlike your neighbor, India, this isn't, things are moving in the right direction, and it's not terribly, I'm sure it's not fun at the moment, and there's an issue of vaccines, but this is, I think, reasonably promising. There's trouble all over the place, but there's trouble in Brazil for sure. And this, I think, is largely attributed to a kind of the absence of vaccines in bulk. They have some Chinese vaccines, but it's not clear yet whether the Chinese vaccine is effective against the so-called Brazilian variant. But anyway, things are somewhat out of control there. And as you well know, that in India, there's a huge surge underway with as many as 300,000 cases, new cases a day. And I live in Milan in northern Italy. We were one of the first really large surges of the coronavirus. And what we experienced was quite frightening. It was a total overwhelming of the healthcare system. So we ran out of hospital capacities. In the early days of the pandemic, nobody really knew how to treat people. They thought the only solution was oxygen. And oxygen's important, but there are other the treatment has gotten better. So the death rate has definitely gone down. But you're seeing similar things now in India, and it seems to have shifted to rural India, where this is what you do not want to see. Basically, is what I'm trying to say. You can't recover in the economy. People living near the margin, in any country, can't afford to have a total and complete shutdown. so the virus, kind of spreads. There's a major issue now about the vaccine rollout. When historians write about this, it's not going to be pretty because the countries that make the vaccines put themselves at the top of the queue. And I think there's an element of that being inevitable. We just do not live in a world with, governance structures that are sufficiently respectful of global public goods and fairness to avoid that kind of outcome. Maybe we will someday, but I don't expect to see it in my lifetime. But where we are in this situation is the vaccine rolled out very fast in a few places. Israel, UK, then the United States kind of got its act together with the new administration, and then there was a lag, and now Europe, continental Europe, is rolling out pretty fast. And once you take care of that, then there's a reasonable amount of vaccine manufacturing capability and a pretty strong push to get rid of any obstacles associated with intellectual property. Now, how this is going to work out, we don't know, but I think there's a reasonable chance you'll see an acceleration in the availability of vaccines on a very wide front, through middle income countries and even, and I hope, into lower income countries where there's a different set of considerations. That's not a done deal, but if I had to make a guess, I would say the binding constraint here is not intellectual property, it's manufacturing capacity. And it's not zero, but you can't ramp it up instantly either. So I would say for a complete kind of global recovery based on vaccine availability, we're probably talking ourselves into 2022. I mean, a hopeful result would be by about a year from now, this virus, is starting to appear in the rearview mirror. It could be worse than that. It's hard to see how it would be a lot better. I mean, if there are people who think we can get this all under control globally by something like the end of this year, this calendar year, but I think that's pretty optimistic, to put it mildly. This has happened several times. So, China had a kind of outbreak. They controlled it, very aggressively. We had outbreaks in the developed countries. We did a terrible job of containing it. And so we basically lived with it. I mean, to this day, the highest number of reported cases is still in the United States, and I think deaths as well. So we basically had to wait for the vaccine, and that is characteristic. If you move outside of East Asia, I think with relatively few exceptions, the vaccine is going to be the containment method. But this is the current situation. So you can see that Santiago, that's Chile, has gotten things under control. Tel Aviv, I think they've vaccinated almost everybody. Los Angeles and New York, so you can see the American cities are coming down. We have trouble in other places and a serious problem with people not wanting to be vaccinated, whereas you can see the big surge in Delhi and now in Goa, which is not rural, but not one of the largest cities. Anyway, you basically have sort of a multi-speed version of the world in terms of viruses. Now, if you sort of shift to what we're experiencing in the recoveries, the first thing to say is that these recoveries are just going to be spectacular looking if you look at growth numbers. And the reason for that is that the pandemic economy essentially required a partial shutdown of really important high employment sectors like hospitality, like retail, et cetera. Hospitality means restaurants, foods, tourism, et cetera. Hotels. These are high employment sectors, and they're going to open up. not, instantly, not at the same time in every part of the world, but they're going to open up. And then you're going to see this, kind of delayed version of a V-shaped recovery. Now that's a little bit overly optimistic. I think international travel is going to stay suppressed for quite a long time. Essentially, well, for two reasons. One, it really isn't safe until everybody's got the thing under control, so that's going to delay it longer. And second, this is something I think we're all familiar with, is when you're trying to get something done and there's multiple jurisdictions, and they aren't coordinated, then it just takes a long time, and it's disorganized. And I think that's what we're going to see in international travel. I'll tell an anecdote. A friend of mine, I wrote something about this, just saying, this is going to be a real challenge because we don't have institutions that, sort of authoritatively coordinate all this kind of stuff. So I said, we're going to have to kind of worry about that. And that will affect the global economy to some extent. A friend of mine in New York said, after they got vaccinated in the early part of this year, they decided to go to Antigua, which is in the Eastern Caribbean. So they flew from New York to St. Martin, and their paperwork wasn't quite right. So they had to spend a day getting the paperwork right in St. Martin. And then they took a boat over to Antigua, which is about 10 miles over the water. And the paperwork they'd been told they needed wasn't correct. So they were sent back to St. Martin from Antigua, and spent another day in St. Martin and got the paperwork done for Antigua right, and eventually got to Antigua. I mean, it's just a classic. I mean, if you were designing a system, you wouldn't probably design it like that. So I think we're going to see a lot of that. But on balance, we're going to see, as the virus is contained, we're going to see rapid recoveries because we had sectors that stayed open and digital sectors that did extremely well, even better than they might have otherwise in the pandemic. And then we're going to have sectors that were suppressed that kind of come back. The growth numbers may fool people, because they're going to be abnormal. And people might think, oh, we're in good shape, but there's a huge difference between growth rates and levels, as you will know. But I think there's a reasonable chance that the global economy in one version or another is going to be back to functioning at a reasonably normal level by the end of 2022. I mean, we're in a period of great uncertainty, so I could be wrong about that. There are some surprising supply problems that are emerging as this recovery occurs. I mean, it may not be the same in every part of the world, but we had a stunningly big miss in the latest employment forecast from economists. They were predicting something like, as the economy recovered in the US, 1 million new jobs. And the number came in at like 250,000. I mean, that's off by a factor of 4. You don't see that very often. And people are scrambling around trying to figure it out. Is it skills mismatches of the type that we knew were there before? Is it the massive fiscal programs have enabled people to sort of say, well, I'm going to go back to the job market, but I'll just wait a little while because I'm kind of okay financially now? Or is it something longer term and structural that we don't know about? But anyway, it got a lot of attention, to put it mildly. But we've got a global shortage of semiconductors that is threatening to sort of shut down or partially shut down a range of industries, from computers to mobile phones to automobiles. The semiconductors are literally everywhere now. We have huge commodity price increases, kind of across the board. The price of lumber in the United States and Canada is just, astronomical compared to what you would think of as normal. So there's something going on. And the thing we don't know is whether these are transitory or not. And there's a very large discussion, for those of you who are in macroeconomics, you'll know about this, in which some very distinguished people are essentially raising a yellow, somewhere between a yellow and a red flag on inflation. And the reason they're doing that is that if I could just spend a minute on this, if you go back to the great financial crisis, pretty much everybody was affected, but that thing started in the United States, and then there was a variant of it in Europe. Most emerging economies had avoided all those toxic assets, and so they weren't really experiencing directly the kind of dysfunction in the financial system that we did. There was a big impact on trade, although it bounced back, so nobody got away unscathed. But it was, relatively. I mean, it was a good performance on the part of the non-developed countries in dealing with it. But the response to that, because of political conditions, both in America and in Europe, they're somewhat different. But Europe has got to get 28 people to agree whenever they do anything, 28 countries. And in the United States, we had gridlock. So we relied on monetary policy, very aggressive monetary policy, to try to engineer a recovery. Multiple rounds of QE, suppressing the yield curve. I think all about this. And that was, most people, I think, looking back at that, say, well, that was better than nothing, but it wasn't ideal. A different balance between monetary and fiscal support would have done the job better. And because the monetary instruments basically don't really deal with all the problems, and they have side effects, like they elevate the price of risk assets, by making less risky assets unattractive, like government bonds, which have negative real yields and actually, in some cases, they had negative interest rates. So everybody thinks they learned a lesson that, you needed the fiscal authorities. And so you might have expected the response to the pandemic and the recovery to be a different mix of monetary and fiscal policy. But what we seem to have is extremely aggressive monetary policy combined this time with much less austerity and aggressive, fiscal programs. And the concern on the part of experts who deal with this all the time is that we're going to reignite inflation and anchor inflationary expectations. If that happens, then the central banks are going to have to react, and you can expect, and not expect, but worry about major resets in asset prices, because they're extraordinarily elevated now. I mean, you don't have to talk to anybody in the investment world, pretty much globally, to discover that, there's lots of interesting investment options, but the prices are ridiculously high. This isn't just in public markets, it's in private equity and venture capital and all that. There's just a ton of money sloshing around looking for returns of a variety of kinds, and they're bidding the prices up, and that just shows up in various, and a major reset, could cause a significant shock. So we're not, I guess, there's at least some concern, as I think a reasonable way to put it, that despite the fact we're in a recovery, you wouldn't call us, sort of in total balance. The macro policies, this varies enormously across the world. So, and the reason is that, countries just differ enormously in how much fiscal space they have to mount these programs. So the United States one has been big. China's has been less big, but they didn't need as big a one because they didn't have as big a contraction, because they contained the virus via other means, lockdowns, reduced mobility, testing, use of digital technology with a mobile health certificate, and all those things I think you probably heard about. So, but now we have this monetary and fiscal stimulus together. And I think, this is how do I say it? In an otherwise, pretty optimistic looking world, if you look out past the virus containment program globally, is a real concern. So let me switch gears. you know, there's lots of ways to kind of get into this subject, but I just wrote something in which I asked myself, so where are we going to see extraordinarily high growth? And I don't mean just growth in the macro sense by sector. I mean, tons of entrepreneurial activity, large amounts of investment going in, rates of return going up, and so on. And my candidates for those, and I think these are realistic and consistent with what we're actually seeing, are one, I think the digital transformation of the economy is accelerating rapidly. If you ask the question why, I think the answer is twofold. One, the pandemic, basically lit a fire. It caused people to do things that they were either reluctant to do or just couldn't be bothered getting around to do because they had to. And that, that might mean revert, but in the course of doing that, they discovered things that that you can think of them as experiments that they might not have thought about or known, and that's going to change the pace. And there's virtually unanimous agreement about that. So you had a huge surge in e-commerce. That won't go back to where it was. You had a huge surge in mobile payments and a whole bunch of, financial, digital fintech, they call it. That's not going to revert. In sectors that were lagging, if you take the studies of, which sectors in the economy had, really adopted a lot of the powerful digital tools we now have available to us, there were lagging sectors like healthcare. But in the pandemic, we had to have telemedicine. We could have had telemedicine before, but we didn't have much of it. We're not going to go back because it's relatively efficient. It'll get better over time. Home diagnostics will get better, and so on. So bottom line is we're going to see an accelerated major transformation of these economies. And there's lots of good things about that, and there's lots of problems, and I'll chat briefly about them later on. Second one is biomedical science and technology and healthcare. And I think this is essentially a similar story. We just have enormously powerful, technologies and tools. They've been in development for a long time, but they're now being deployed. And solutions, diseases, drugs, etc. I mean, it's a major growth area. And the last one is slightly more speculative because this problem of energy transformation and climate change has been with us for a long time. But now I think you have a situation in which pretty much globally now, especially since the United States got back in the game with the Biden administration, rejoined the Paris Accords, and up the ante in terms of commitment and so on. So the notion that, if the big players like China and the United States drop out, who cares? I mean, we can't solve the problem anyway. That's kind of gone away, but at a much more micro level, everybody from ordinary citizens to businesses to the financial community has decided to sort of take this seriously. And what you have, therefore, is a tremendous demand for solutions in terms of energy efficiency, green energy production, recycling, and a whole lot of other things, and then powerful technologies that need to be developed in order to solve these problems. So I think it's a reasonable guess that a third growth area for the next decade or two at least is going to lie in this area. And one of the things that intrigues me, and this will, I think, especially be interesting to young people, is there is really a global explosion of entrepreneurial activity now. We used to have a relatively small number of places in the world, where you had a huge amount of entrepreneurial activity and the sort of ecosystems that support it, the financing and all the other stuff that goes with it. Silicon Valley was one, there were others. But it's spreading, so if you look around the world now, virtually everywhere, you see entrepreneurial activity. I think it's partly due to the digital transformation, because these digital ecosystems have low entry barriers and they are now equipped with very powerful tools. I had this interesting conversation with a friend of mine, James Manika, who's one of the directors and the co-chairman of the McKinsey Global Institute. And he said, well, we've had these tools for a while, things like artificial intelligence and machine learning. And I said, yeah, we have, but that means Google had them and Amazon had them and Alibaba had them, et cetera. But now they're generally available, right? So you got big, really powerful tools available to solve all kinds of problems out there. And you are seeing this, quite amazing, almost global in scope, a burst of entrepreneurial activity. And and I think if you look, this is a slide that I borrowed from friends of mine at General Atlantic with their permission. It's just a tabulation. I think you all know what unicorns are. It's a company that rapidly it gets to $1 billion in terms of valuation. So it's a kind of partial index of some of this entrepreneurial activity. If you looked at this 15 years ago, A, there wouldn't be that many, and B, they would be mostly in 1 or 2 countries, probably most of them in the United States and the UK. But now here you see there there's still a lot in the United States. China is number 2 now. India is coming up rapidly. I would expect, you know more about Pakistan than I do, but I don't see any reason why Pakistan won't be on this graph in the relatively near future, and so on. You see, this is just, and this is, some of these economies like Israel are relatively small, but anyway, you see that there's a kind of opportunity set that really wasn't there before. And I can't overemphasize the importance of these ecosystems. You don't get this kind of in a vacuum. You get it because what's being built out underneath this is a kind of global capacity to both finance and support companies, like this. And I think, while this is a quite microeconomic view of the world, it gives you a quite different picture of what's going on than when you sort of sit, just look at kind of macroeconomic data. And let me close with this. I think there is a good chance, although this is a little speculative, that we're going to have a burst of productivity growth. You all know that we had a burst of productivity growth of varying magnitudes in the late 90s to the early 2000s. That was largely digital in origin. But it looks like we're going to have another one. Again, it won't be all digital, but it'll be substantially digital. And it's going to occur because A, the tools are there, B, of the pandemic acceleration, which we just talked about. There's just a widespread perception in the world now, including, in what I called earlier lagging sectors, that, digital is a pretty important element of resilience, let alone, meaning shock-proofing your employment, your company, or whatever it is. And so I think, whether this comes true or not is not going to be determined only by, the leading companies and sectors, the so-called superstars. It's going to be determined of whether it spreads rapidly throughout the economy, and so pessimists might think this isn't very likely, but I think there's a pretty good chance. That'll be great. That means global growth will go up, and it may help deal with some of the tensions that we're dealing with. If I had to, I'd be happy to talk about these, but it isn't all kind of rosy. we have a kind of partial breakdown of international cooperation and the institutions that support it. We have, on a very broad front, a kind of, I put nationalism, but I mean a kind of, an ugly form of nationalism, not a more benign form. And along with that, a lot of, in at least in places that I live and work, a lot of political and social polarization and fragmentation. And that's a problem because it's hard to have sensible economic policies emerge. And second, it's very hard to have sensible rebuilding of international cooperative agreements, to reflect new realities when you've got a kind of inward looking focus in many countries. The Trump administration was a kind of exaggerated extreme version of this, but it's, but the end of that administration doesn't mean it's kind of gone away. And the last challenge, the digital technologies are going to be a challenge for us in regulatory terms because they're at least a double-edged sword, right? They have enormous capacity to build inclusive growth models, but they also can divide us. There's skills problems, there's employment related to automation. And the one that worries me is that the early stage growth model, the one we learned from Asia, it is based on comparative advantage engaging with the global economy, largely in labor intensive manufacturing, process oriented manufacturing and assembly. That model in the digital era may not work, or it may not be very powerful. And you're starting to see evidence of that. Danny Roderick and others have done studies that suggest that, you have what he calls premature deindustrialization, which means when you look at the manufacturing that's being undertaken in some of these countries, it doesn't generate much employment. And if you don't have the employment engines, then you don't have the mechanism for, the growth to spread and generate the demand that in a middle income country helps sustain the growth. So I think there's a real challenge there. What's the new growth model? And that's something we don't know the answer to. So, Bud and Nadeem, why don't I stop there? And because I think I want to leave some time for a conversation. I think you're on mute. Oh.
Thank you very much. Great presentation. We needed a dose of optimism, which you've given us. Thank you very much. We can look forward to a better future. After a year of sitting alone in my room and doing Zoom, I've lost the human contact. And I don't know whether I'll come back to reality anymore or not. I feel uncomfortable with people now, I think. Yeah. But I just want to raise a quick question. What about vaccine nationalism that everybody has been talking about? And in a country like Pakistan, where we've got 220 million people, and we estimate that we need to vaccinate at least 100, maybe 120 million people before we can reach herd immunity. And we're going at the rate of a few 100,000 per day. So we need to ramp it up to 2 million. And yet it seems that there's going to be some form of vaccine nationalism. And then related to that also, vaccine passports are coming in. So we've relied on international remittances. And if our people can't travel, we are in trouble. Almost, we get as much from remittances as exports. So how do you see that?
So, sticking with my optimism, I think we're in the bad period where the United States, Europe, basically put themselves at the top of the queue. And which means that basically there was a lag in getting the vaccines to everybody. Europe was a bit of a victim of that because they weren't aggressive in acquiring vaccines, and even though they had the resources to do it. So you see an example of that, but that's going away now quite quickly. You can see the rates of vaccination are going up. So but what I'm expecting is that once you take care of the people who put themselves at the top of the queue, then basically you're going to see two things happen. One, the vaccine production will start flowing into much larger range of countries, including yours. And two, how do I say it? The international arrangements, will facilitate that. So we have COVAX. COVAX is basically an international effort to get the vaccine spread around the world. It's been underfunded so far, but that's changing, and it's had trouble getting enough vaccines. So, if Pfizer just decides they don't have to ship most of them to the United States and Europe, Pfizer BioNTech and Moderna and others, then I think, you'll start to see the supply grow. The WTO is dealing with the intellectual property, issues. And the Biden administration has said, basically, they're going to support the, temporary suspension of the intellectual property rights of the manufacturer, the developers of the vaccine. That doesn't necessarily solve the problem. But, there's a question of whether you just suspend it or have mandatory licensing. That's a little subtle, but it's actually important. What you don't want to do is solve this problem in a way that damages the incentives of these folks to produce vaccines rapidly on the next round. You don't want to win the battle and lose the war, in other words. So we got to do this right. But the bottom line, Nadeem, is I'm expecting a very rapid increase in the availability of vaccines globally around the world. And I think the binding constraint is going to turn out to be manufacturing capacity.
Okay. And since I'm going to play the pessimist, let me also raise another pessimistic question. I share your enthusiasm about the digital economy, but there are those digital pessimists who talk about labor market implications of the digital economy, and that it could lead to further rise in inequality, and especially countries like ours, which offer raw labor. How will we be able to handle the possible shift in unemployment? For example, very simple question. When you go to New York or Chicago or Washington, D.C., more than likely you're going to meet a Pakistani or a third world taxi driver. And if he's going to be unemployed thanks to automation, he's going to return home and pose a problem for us. So how do you see the labor market implications of that? Do you see a rise of universal basic income? Will the US agree to that? Do you see what other measures can we take, or do you see major shifts in inequality and therefore further social strife?
Yeah, I think we're in for a tough period. But as compared with, how do I say this? If you go back 10 years, we had a problem of rising inequality, in part driven by what I call an earlier form of automation. That is the kind of automation you can do just with computers and networks, and you don't need artificial intelligence, right? You need artificial intelligence for autonomous vehicles and modern robots. So we got another round coming, but you didn't need it then. And studies by David Autor and others said, we were losing routine jobs, at a fairly rapid rate in the economy, and where routine meant codifiable. You could tell a machine how to do it, and then they kind of did it. And that was in the white collar world as well. In fact, prominently in the white collar world. This was information handling and processing. Right. And so the bottom line is, I think, we're gonna have a tough transition. And as people's human capital adapts to a kind of different set of technological, characteristics in the environment. I don't think it's unsolvable. And I think different countries and societies will handle it differently. I mean, if I had to make a prediction, I would say Sweden will do better than the United States. Because they will have an attitude toward, redistributing income that is helpful in limiting inequality and giving people the resources to invest in their own human capital. And secondly, both the government and the corporate sector will have the attitude that they're in this game and they have to be part of the solution, which means essentially retraining people or training people. On the other hand, you've got places where parts of the business community viewed labor as a kind of expendable input like any other input, and that's not going to cut it. So, I think it's an all hands on deck deal, and it's a difficult transition, especially if the digital revolution occurs really quickly. So, I think possible to handle this reasonably well. And yes, I think some version of a universal basic income makes a lot of sense. But it's not the whole story, Nadeem. I mean, you can protect people at the bottom end of, or if they fall to the bottom end of the income spectrum, but you've also got to have, a way of thinking about and dealing with, the vast majority of people, say, Ken Rogoff would say the bottom 60% who are going to go through these transitions as the economy shifts. So we need to figure out, how we're going to help people do that.
Excellent. Thank you. Then let me turn to the floor. Lots of people are lined up to ask questions. So I want to.
I see a lot of hands. That's great.
I know. Rahat Sher Khan. Rahat Sher Khan.
Oops. Yeah.
Takes a while, that's all. Rahat, are you there? Okay. Attas Afzal.
Okay, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Go ahead. Go ahead, Attas. Go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Spence, for a very interesting presentation. I wanted to just comment on this thing you said about that the constraints in the system when it comes to vaccine are one of manufacturing and not of intellectual property rights. I think intellectual property rights are a very, very big challenge in getting vaccines to the global south. For example, if Western countries or countries of the global north give us the technology or the knowledge, we can produce these vaccines here. And the level of catastrophe and calamity that has befallen global south, countries of the global south, and I think it is imperative that we rethink TRIPS regime, WTO, and the present international order, which is not working for the countries of the global south. So that's the first point I wanted to make. And very quick question that I want to ask you is this: you actually mentioned this in your comments, how thinking is changing in the U.S. with President Biden making huge injections of money into the U.S. economy. I think something to the tune of $4.5 trillion we are talking about. Now, some voices are being raised against it, primarily by Larry Summers and Glenn Hubbard, who are saying that this is not simply using fiscal policy. It's basically increasing the size of the government or the state. What is your position when it comes to bringing about economic growth, especially? Should we go the route of the state? That is, a planning commission in Pakistan, and you're very familiar with the work of planning commission.
Just let him answer. We've got a lot of people. Go ahead,
I
Professor.
heard this interview by. Okay, I'll let you answer this question. Thank you.
Go ahead.
So, I mean, basically on the first set of things, I agree with you. I mean, I was being optimistic because I think we're going to sort them out. But you do need international agreements, and you do have to have conditions under which you suspend, in some form or other, intellectual property rights. So I'm on your side on that. I think the WTO is addressing that, and hopefully they'll get it right. Look, I mean, on part of the intellectual property. I mean, I don't want to get too deeply into this, but part of the intellectual property, because these are pretty fancy vaccines. Messenger RNA hasn't been around for very long, is the manufacturing technology. So when you license it, or just move it across a border to some other firm, you're doing more than licensing a vaccine. I mean, transferring intellectual property with respect to a specific vaccine. You're transferring intellectual property on manufacturing. And so then you have to start to be careful about what you're doing. Right? Because if you do this in a way that sends a clear message, look, you have to have a system to suspend it. My preferred system is a compulsory licensing, because that leaves open the opportunity to pay reasonable royalties, say from international financial institutions or developed countries that can afford it for that, to get the thing out into the world. But it's complicated. And the last thing I'll say, is it's a question of, time, right? I mean, almost nobody thinks that if you license a manufacturing technology and a new vaccine or drug, that within a month, it'll be up and running, right? So there is a peak load problem associated with handling pandemics, right? There's a point I've made, I don't think anybody was listening, which is if you really want to have manufacturing and rapid response mechanisms, then you need excess manufacturing capacity globally, going in, right? And if you don't, and that the private sector has no way at all of solving that problem, right? That somebody's got to pay for that because it's going to be idle most of the time or used for some other purpose or something, right? Anyway, it's another dimension of the problem. But on the fiscal stimulus side, I mean, I'll just say kind of very briefly, there are people who are scared about big government. So I'll just tell you my view. I think our government's been too small, and it's been particularly neglectful of really crucial, public sector investment in human capital, declining commitment to sort of the science and technology base of the economy and infrastructure. And so if you had a sensible program, I mean, the numbers are huge, right? We had a big stimulus under the Trump administration. We had 1.9 as a recovery program, and now we have an unknown so-called infrastructure, 10-year infrastructure investment program that's going to get debated and probably downsized in Congress, in the course of the next few months. But if they downsize it too much, and if the ground is, that we don't want a big government, then we'll pay the price, right? I mean, there aren't any growth models I've ever seen, that work where you write the government out of the script, whether it's a developed country or a developing country. And there's lots of examples of that. So I'm kind of hopeful that they'll compromise and reach agreement, and not get hung up on the ideology of, what's the big, and what's a big government? A big government to me is not really a big government. It's an effective government that solves problems. Over to you.
Great, thank you. Can we have Dr. Azra? Dr. Azra, please introduce yourself and ask your question quickly. We need lots of people, so please be brief.
I'll stay, so.
Dr. Azra?
Yes, I am Dr. Azra Sayyida Azra Abdul, assistant professor from Bahawalpur University, Multan. And this is very good discussion. I think this is thought-provoking and giving insight to the other economists. And especially, I want to ask a question about that. No, it is the time. Previously and prior to this COVID-19, the economists were talking about the independence of the central banks, and now that we are in COVID crisis and we need more money, and that they are talking about the zero interest rate and negative interest rate at the same time. And similarly, there's a fiscal policy. So how can you justify the independence of central banks while the government need more money and it is looking at the central banks to pump new money into the economy? So kindly please.
Yeah, sure. Professor Spence, let me just preface that question a little bit. The IMF is at the moment putting a condition on us, and the law is in the parliament on central bank independence. That is why this question has been asked. It's a very extreme central bank independence law that we are passing. So go ahead, please.
Yes. Can I ask a question, please?
Yeah, jaldi kare because unhe jana hai.
Acha. So people are saying that this is sequel of the Great Depression and this is sequel of the Second World War II in terms of the human lives and in terms of economic crisis. How would you suggest that in the light of this COVID-19, that what is the remedy of the twin problems of the human lives and the economic crisis, please?
Okay, fair enough. Professor Spence, over to you.
So I think, central banks, on the independence question, extreme independence is not a good idea. Central banks ultimately, like every other institution in society, ideally at least, need to be accountable. And the way they're put together and appointed means they are accountable. And there are variations. I mean, one way to make a central bank limited in terms of how much it can muck around in the economy is to narrowly define its mandate. No, that's a judgment call, right? But I think a central bank that has a mandate, that includes inflation, financial stability, which is crucial because sometimes they have to take care of that, and there isn't anybody else who can do it. When the payment system locks up, or all the financial institutions don't think they're solvent, or something like that. And then the one that's a little more questionable is sort of employment or growth or some version of that. But I think those are reasonable mandates. I mean, where I think we're going to probably have a rethink based on this experience in the last 10 to 15 years is I don't think it's a good idea to leave the central bank out there independently trying to solve problems that aren't solved best by the central bank operating by itself. I mean, I really do think that on the last round, we had the wrong mix of monetary and fiscal policy. Now, this time, we may have, a different mix, but too much of it. and as we go ahead. So, but I think extreme restrictions on a central bank or, excessive a friend of mine, was actually on the Growth Commission. I won't say from what country, once describes their central bank as an independent republic. I mean, so they said, well, they don't really care. They'll do things that, cause the exchange rate to go skyrocket. And, they'll put whole export sectors out of business, but they're independent. They don't care. I mean, in the end, I think, this is common sense and judgment makes sense. The second part of that was what, Nadeem?
Second part, she was asking about whether this is in some way likened to a major shift in the global world, like the Great Depression or the recession. And I think you kind of answered that, but if you want to sum it up, sure.
That's hard to say at this point. I mean, I think the probably the most likely way to think about this, other than is that, you won't see a sudden change in direction, or at least, or it won't be visible at the time, but that this will accelerate, both positive and negative trends. The shift of the center of gravity of the global economy to Asia, East and South, is a done deal, right? I mean, it would take a cataclysm to prevent that from happening. So that's just going to, that's the way it is. And I don't have any problem with that. I think the digital was underway before, and we're going to see a massive acceleration of it. I think the harder one to get at, and I'll just stop, is are we going to see a renewed commitment to kind of, critical elements of global cooperation, or are we going to see more, let's call it fragmentation? And that one's harder to call. I really don't know.
Agreed. Asim Saeed Saab, I think member of the Planning Commission, please go ahead.
Oh. Thank you. Professor Spence, this was extremely enlightening, and thank you for the presentation. My question is more on the consequence of the pandemic, especially on the central banks and governments. Typically, what they have done, and you also mentioned, in order to help the economies, they brought the interest rates down through a lot of money pumped a lot of monies into the economy. Some of the governments also took up fiscal interventions, as you rightly mentioned. Now, a consequence of that probably is that we see extremely elevated asset prices. And I completely concur with you, because when I speak to my private banker, it's very difficult for me to allocate my assets. It's hard to find yield anywhere. And we constantly talk about it. But as a banker, as an ex-banker, I'm extremely afraid in these times when I see this. Because when I look back to 2007, and I clearly remember the global head of Citibank, I used to work for Citigroup. The lady came to us and said that she's afraid. She said, I don't know what's going to happen, but something is going to happen. And lo and behold, in 2007, we had the financial crisis. Now, you did mention that because of inflation tick up, rates could be reset and there could be a readjustment in the asset prices, which is fair enough. But my question is that do you actually see a financial crisis brewing in the backdrop similar to 2007? And if so, which area do you suspect it to be in? Thank you.
It's a really good question. So I guess to avoid wandering around, no, I'm not with a high probability expecting a financial crisis. But it's a risky environment for two reasons. One, after the global financial crisis, when you might have expected the global economy to deleverage a bit, we did the opposite. So quite independent of what happened in the last couple of years, we just ran up a lot of gross debt around the world. I mean, China ran it up from quite low to like 270% of GDP, putting them in about the same league as the rest of us, and so on. Now, so that's point one. And second, we've run up debt again. At least the countries that had the fiscal capacity to do it used it, at least to some extent. So we didn't reverse that trend. We augmented it. So I think the system is in some sense more fragile. Having said that, the great financial crisis, the origin of it was running up debt initially in the household sector, where it's extremely dangerous, right? You run up debt and build up asset prices. I mean, we have housing bubbles, that are mini versions of this all the time, right? And they always collapse, right? Because the asset values are unrealistic. They're only being propped up by the debt. And we just had a massive version of that. And so when the whole thing crumped, quite apart from, so we saved the financial system, which was politically massively unpopular, but wasn't what brought the house down. What brought the house down was the massive loss of wealth in the household sector. So they stopped consuming, and when lo and behold, people were unemployed and all. This doesn't feel like that. The big run up in debt for properly regulated, economies and financial systems is mainly on the public sector side. And so that's a different kettle of fish. I mean, it's just, it's not that it's unrealistically, that it's risk-free, but there's more instruments for dealing with it. So, I do expect in a number of emerging economies that are in fragile condition, there will be debt restructuring, and other stuff that's turbulent. And a number of us, including, members of this commission that Joe and I chair, think we should get ready for that. That's a fairly common view. But it doesn't elevate to the point of view of really dangerous. Now, if you start to see run-ups in debt in the corporate sector or the financial sector, or even in household sectors, then I think it's a completely different story.
Let me bring in Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali, do you want to ask anything? Please introduce yourself and ask a question.
Can you hear me, sir?
Yeah.
We can. Go ahead.
Sir, I am Muhammad Ali. I've been working in State Bank of Pakistan offsite supervision and enforcement department. And I've been working in State Bank for past 12 years. It was a very informative session. I just wanted to chip in. A part of my questions are already been asked. But I just wanted to ask, sir, that according to his research, which country does he think would be able to recover the fastest from this post-pandemic COVID period? And secondly, it's a bit of a related question, if you can bear with me. Do you think that the strategy of giving loan extensions that the banks a lot of central banks in a lot of countries in the world have adopted this strategy of giving loan repayment extensions to the customers? But the point is that the pandemic isn't over. It's gonna be here to stay for I think for another couple of years, even if all the countries are going to get vaccinated completely. But in this scenario, the situation of people is not really changing. I mean, if the bank gives a loan repayment deferment period of 1 year to the customer, and the pandemic is still here, the businesses are not being allowed to open to their fullest, to their full capacity. So do you think that they will be able to recover?
Go ahead.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Good questions. Fastest recovery. I mean, the fastest recovery was China, for sure. We've already seen it. They contained the virus. They're the only major country in the world that had positive real growth in 2020, 2.3%. And as far as I can see, they're doing fine now. So they get the first prize. I would see the second fastest recovery, at least in major economies, will probably be the US because of the vaccines and, other elements of kind of dynamism. I'm a little more worried about Europe. I think it will be relatively slower, partly because the underlying conditions are more difficult. I mean, you see this clearly in a place like Italy, where I live and I'm sitting. So our total real growth for the last 2 decades was, I mean, I don't mean to be impolite, but negligible. So when we come out of this, the question is, are conditions going to be different? And are we all of a sudden going to look like a superstar as a country in terms of growth? The answer is, even though we've got a pretty competent government right now, and the vaccine rollout is going better, and so on, it's an enormous leap of faith to think that, we'll all of a sudden, find a whole bunch of growth engines that, weren't there before. So on the loan replacement, I think, by and large, I think it's a good idea. But it has to be backed up by substantial fiscal resources, right? You can't just tell banks to extend the repayments, because eventually you do enough balance sheet damage to the bank that, you're starting to hurt the financial system. So in the end, one way and another, you need either the central bank or the fiscal authorities or some combination of the two to kind of take care of the problem. And but I think it's a good idea. I mean, part of the purpose of, responding aggressively in the context of the pandemic is to prevent the sort of, wholesale destruction of businesses that are otherwise in normal conditions healthy. Now, I understand your point. If this drags on for 3 or 4 years, this gets pretty expensive. And so maybe, you kind of run out of the capacity to do it. But then, then you're going to have another problem. You're going to have a lot of businesses that were destroyed and employment that went with it and other things. So, nobody likes running up, liabilities on the public sector side. But it may be better than the alternative, right? Which is producing, a fairly large amount of destruction of value in the rest of the economy.
Thank you. Jamal Khan.
Professor, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, please introduce yourself, Jamal sir.
Professor Spence, thanks for your insightful talk. I am Jamal Khan. I am residing in the city of Wuhan, China. So,
well, you have, right?
Yes, I am the, yes. So, as the world is entered into a new normal, like we have to live with contagion and recession both. Like we have stagnation and inflation were viewed as alternatives in the 1960s until they combined into stagflation in 1970.
Yeah.
So this time, policymakers, they are confronted with different issues, because in normal crisis we have some stimulus packages which can like inject supply and demand side effects. But here, because due to pandemic, both supply and demand side effects, we the stimulus would not produce that type of effect because due to pandemic. So as far like economist or uh, W Health Organization, they are saying that countries should go big and act fast to make the economic recovery and also to make the pandemic like epidemiological curve flatten. So in my case, I did a study on Italy. So what we have find in our study that Italy has like their economic collapse was almost similar to the Second World War, like 30. A lot of their sectors they have uh, major collapses. So in a country like Pakistan, I have one serious concern.
Mhm.
Like first of all, we have uncoordinated approach from the very start. Like our provincial governments, they have different approach to tackle the pandemic. We don't have like coordinated approach. And secondly, we are facing some institutional problems in our country.
जल्दी
Like
करें यार, सवाल पूछ लो
have,
जल्दी से.
we have National Accountability Bureau. So
Okay.
they are not making decision like about the buying the vaccines for the country.
Come to
So
the question,
how?
Jamal. Come to the question.
So what is your suggestion related to Pakistan or other developing country like China, like India, where we have like different family structure, different economic
Yeah.
structure? So how these countries should go, should act in this scenario?
Fair. Let's go. Mhm.
Um, so uh, part of what you said sounded familiar. You know, we had states in the United States going all over the place doing their own thing. Look, I mean, this is going to sound extreme, but in a pandemic, the central government has to take over, and they have to treat it like a wartime economy. You know, many of you are not old enough to remember, you know, World War II, but I was born in World War II, and my father was part of the price control system. Well, what happens in a major war is that all of society's resources are by command devoted to the war effort, right? Which leaves shortages and other stuff all over the place, right? You know, because so prices will go through the roof if left unconnected, and you know, and unregulated and so on. So you get a completely different economy, but it's absolutely necessary, right? And in a pandemic like this, you need to redirect the resources of the economy to dealing with it, right? It may not be, the analogy may not be perfect, but it is an enormous logistical, you know, challenge to buy all the stuff that you need, you know, create a distribution system that didn't exist before, get rid of all the blockages associated with decentralization that works in normal times. It doesn't work, right? I mean, you can't, you know, if you need to make tanks and fighter aircraft, you can't have, you know, some part of the economy off making convertibles for a bunch of people, right? So I think one of the lessons that'll be learned from this is that when, you know, we need a mechanism both domestically and internationally to identify a crisis, you know, and then which causes a semi-automatic suspension of the normal procedures and rules. And it has to be centrally run. There's no alternative. You decentralize it, then it'll get disorganized instantly. And you know, the vaccine rollouts are a perfect example of this. I mean, we started out on the wrong foot. If you take the United States case, we only got the thing under control when the central government basically took it over. Now, that didn't mean they delivered all the vaccines, right? And it was only a partial takeover because they inherited a mess. But I mean, the point I'm trying to make is if the going in assumption is that, you're going to keep operating the economy and the business and the decentralization by states and all that sort of stuff as a given, you are severely constraining the effectiveness of the crisis response mechanisms. And the same applies internationally, I think. There's variations, but if it's all decentralized.
You have time to take 2 or 3 more questions, Michael, or shall we close?
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely.
Okay. Jaja Bakhtiar. Please introduce yourself.
No,
We can hear you. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Nadeem, for making this arrangement. And thank you very much for your kind lecture, Sir Michael Spence. I wanted just to ask about only one thing, that this recovery, post-pandemic recovery, I forgot to mention I'm working for KP government as senior economist, provincial KP government. Yes. So we are expecting this recovery to have negative trends and positive trends, and both will be in accelerated mode. If you can just give us a few hints, which are going to be positively accelerated and which are negative. Thank you very much.
Okay, fair enough. Go ahead.
So on the positive side, I think I tried to sort of at least touch on that issue in that discussion of these high growth sectors. So I think for young people, given that in those sectors, there's really interesting, it's not just young people, but for people who have the kind of right spirit about it, and certainly that would include a lot of young people who want to make a contribution to their society and maybe even a global contribution, and at the same time do something that's really engaging and productive. There's just big opportunities, and they're expanding globally. So it used to be that if you wanted to do something like that, you had to move physically. And I think that's becoming less and less true. For me, that's pretty exciting. I think that's in digital, it's in healthcare, it's in sustainability for sure. But when I say digital, there may be a tendency to think, well, there's a bunch of sectors, like semiconductors and computers, but I mean every sector, right? The opportunity set is to sort of strengthen the business models and the engagement and so on, regardless of which sector you're in. It could be healthcare, it could be hospitality. I really think it's, taking the mom and pop shops and giving them sort of digitally oriented supply chain support and capabilities, integrating e-commerce with that kind of offline world, similar things in financial technology and inclusion and so on. We could spend all afternoon on it, but or evening in your case, but I think it's just an enormous set of opportunities. What I think challenges, I think the international travel is going to be, every country has challenges, right? The two that I think are really difficult are ones that require coordination, like international travel to get right. So we've already talked about that, and we'll go on at great length. The other set of things that, I think we are at the moment hopelessly bad at addressing are things like cybersecurity, right? We just had a successful ransom attack on one of the major gas pipelines. I don't mean natural gas, I mean petroleum pipelines that runs from essentially Texas all the way up the East Coast of the United States. That shut it down, right? And ransomware, I think it's an attack where they basically take control of your data, and if you don't pay them a fairly large amount of money, they destroy the data, which puts you out of business. Imagine a bank that doesn't have any data left. These are they may be non-state actors, they may be state actors, but at the moment, these are big threats, and we don't have any internationally coordinated way of taking care of them. We may not even have the tools. right? And that's just one example. I mean, we've got problems with internet content and whether or not it's consistent with society's values or stability. You know, and countries are going their own way on that because they have different histories and values and whatnot. But that's going to fragment the internet. I mean, in other words, there's lots and lots of challenges out there that right now we kind of don't know how to deal with.
Can we go to Shujat Ahmed? I think another voice from the China. Shujat, are you in China? Go ahead.
Thank you very much, sir. No, not in China still. I'm in Islamabad. I'm doing my PhD from Beijing University of Technology. My I just with a quick question. How are we going to open our economic system while staying in pandemic and post-pandemic period? Thank you.
Okay, fair enough. Go ahead, sir. Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, I'll be really brief on this. I mean, I'm not alone in this, but I've said all along, you can't open the economy successfully if you don't have the pandemic under control. And there's only two ways to do that. You can do it the way China did, or you can do it with vaccines, but you just won't have a recovery. And the reasons are, you know, there's two reasons why these, you know, depressed sectors are in that state. One of them is they're told to shut down, and the other one is people are risk averse and they just don't go. That's not everybody, but there's enough of them to produce a fairly major dent in demand. So I stick with it. I mean, I think, you know, the people, the countries that are, you know, dealt with this in the most alert way, and they're mainly in Asia, are the ones that had understood this right from the get-go, that you can't just sort of, you know, kind of muddle along and deal with the virus and hope the economy comes back, you know, when you don't have it under control. And second, a lot of these countries had practice, you know, with MERS, with SARS-1, you know, without other outbreaks that were much more contained, but they had systems in place, you know, to react. Whereas the rest of us were just, this is American slang, but we were caught flat-footed, meaning we weren't ready at all. And so, you know, we were disorganized, and that's what, you know,
good.
If you don't contain let me put it another way. This is sort of going back to the kind of history of the last year. You've got a big chance in the early stages of containing it, but once it's uncontained, most of those mechanisms don't work very well anymore, right? And then you have to resort to these lockdowns and the things that have the big adverse contractionary economic effects. So if you want to avoid that, then you have to catch it early, which means you be careful of the borders. Everybody does that now. Test, you know, extensively, etc. There are no guarantees, but I mean, that's the only way. That's the only known way to do it.
Alia Khan.
Well,
Alia there?
I don't see him, but
no, I don't see her. I think she's gone. Alia, you
no,
there?
I'm here. I wasn't being unmuted by the.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Spence. My question is about an issue that has really become very, very important, especially for developing and emerging economies, and that is of the informal economy. I'd just like to hear your thoughts on that, because all of a sudden, when social protection measures were, you know, they became necessary to be rolled out, the countries found that their informal economy was not documented at all. So how do you see this issue, and how important do you think it is to move from the informal to the formal economy route? Thank you.
No, it's a very good question. So formal has different kind of connotations or meanings to people depending on, you know, so sometimes people are talking about the labor market. Sometimes they're talking about simply what you just mentioned, which is, you know, are you documented? Do you have an identity that allows the systems to deal with you? on they're both important. The identity one and the ability to is critical, because that's how you own land, have a bank account, are a known quantity in the social security system and stuff like that. I think with digital technology, there's a real chance we can, over time, eliminate that problem. Basically, give everybody a secure digital identity that makes them, part of the system, if I can put it that way. And then that will, certainly help in dealing with crises, because you won't have a bunch of people who are essentially anonymous to the system. There's an extended version of that, which has to do with big data, right? There's a lot of people who are, in principle, have an identity, but they're actually unknown quantities, right? They don't have high incomes or wealth. They don't have a lot of property. They can't borrow money because they don't have a lot of collateral. They don't have a history or track record. And one of the things this Luan Academy is doing, is using the Chinese data and watching what's going on. Is if you have a nearly universal mobile payment system, which almost everybody uses, which you can do if you have the infrastructure, and almost everybody's walking around, with a mobile internet in their pocket, you can have a mobile payment system where everybody has a track record. And it turns out that track record can be used to do things like extend credit on reasonable terms. Now, I think there's just enormous potential, in other words, in this general territory, for both entrepreneurs and social entrepreneurs to start to remove at least some of the disadvantages that we've associated with informality.
Good, thank you. Shahid?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Just a few quick questions. Thank you, Professor Spence, for this very nice talk. So for my first question is, you mentioned something very interesting. You said something about productivity surge, which is quite true. It happens in recessions, but how does that stack up against the secular stagnation hypothesis? I mean, would your supposed productivity surge be tapered down a bit by that secular stagnation, which Larry Summers and other economists they refer to? And my second question, again a short one, how do you see the importance of pharmaceuticals industry or pharmaceutical sector in a country, especially post COVID-19? Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, Mike.
On the second one, I think everybody's going to want to have one. We're going to see, there's a general trend, which is people are going to want to be more self-sufficient in certain areas, and pharmaceuticals, meaning manufacturing capability. I mean, I don't think everybody is going to be at the forefront in terms of, gene editing and stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, I think countries, middle-income countries that can afford it, are going to probably say to themselves, gee, there's a few sectors that we'd really like to have around here, and we're going to have, I don't know, I mean, national champions fund it, but make sure it happens. On productivity, I think one of the reasons, there may be a burst of productivity here is that you have, on the supply side, it looks like you've got technologies that have the capacity to do it if they're widely enough deployed. So that's sort of point one. And point two, I think we all know kind of intuitively, even if we don't have models that say it explicitly, is that, the incentives to get on with it are much higher if the economy is running hot, meaning at high intensity, meaning not demand short. And so one of the reasons for optimism is it looks like the policymakers at the macro level are going to, at least for a period of time, work hard on various things that could be a drag on demand. And those would be, well, the macroeconomic things first, right? But also the distribution of income. I mean, if you take the Biden administration, for example, this may be backwards and they just care about the middle class. But, if you have a continuing situation in which the lion's share of the incremental value creation, income and, things that you can measure in markets, going to the absolute top of the income spectrum and the owners of capital, you just won't have the demand in the economy to run it at high intensity. So you can use the fiscal mechanisms in the interim to do that, but in the end, you have to sort of shift the purchasing power, to a group of people who are actually going to want to spend the money and have the resources to do it. And this is, by the way, I mean, I think it's critical in the emerging economies too. I mean, you don't have to read very many documents coming out of China to know that building the middle class is a core element. Building the middle class and raising consumption as a fraction of total aggregate demand is an absolutely critical element. I mean, they're struggling with it, but it's a critical element of the sort of growth dynamics. I think the same kind of thing is, if we do it right, in other words, the bottom line is, I think I'm not terribly worried about secular stagnation, because we ought to have somebody who's a proponent of that, like Larry here, who could defend it. But I think that's kind of where we're going.
Thank you. Last question, Mohammad Khurram Shabir.
Yes, hello.
Go ahead.
Yes, I am Khurram, a PhD student from Namal, Islamabad.
Yeah.
And I feel honored that Professor Michael is here. So I have a short question that, so how do you see, like in the near future, how the machine learning and its algorithms will impact the financial decision making? How it will?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So that's a very good question. So, but I'll just assume everybody on the call is, kind of a passing familiarity with machine learning, right? It's kind of fancy pattern recognition. It's great, in constrained domains, and it so far, I mean, nothing's permanent in this world, but so far it doesn't shift domains the way we do easily, and then change kind of the interpretation of the signals that we're receiving. But it's very powerful, right? And it does make machines superhuman in certain dimensions, and so on. So in finance, I believe that, like a number of other areas, almost everybody will operate with increasingly powerful digital assistants, essentially, that deploy their superhuman capacities to detect patterns, to flag things that are important that, we just don't have the capacity to process. I think the same thing will happen in medicine. Doctors have, good doctors have to read a vast amount of literature to try to find the 5 articles a month that are critical to their specialty. These digital assistants can do it, in 1/10 of a second, and say, look, these are the 5 articles you need to read. You don't have to stumble around anymore. So I think that's going to happen in finance. What I don't think will happen is that the machines will be good automated investors, if I can put it that way. And the reason is, it looks to me in financial markets like there's regime changes. That is, it's not just a matter of pattern recognition. It's this reflexiveness that George Soros used to talk about. It's the whole. Really good investors are good at not only figuring out kind of what's going on in the markets, but part of that is figuring out what the other people are thinking, right? And I don't think the machine learning is kind of up to that level yet. So I'm a little more skeptical about that. But they're going to be there, like they're going to be everywhere else. I call them digital assistants. They're I don't know, machines, right? That detect patterns. There's a very good book for kind of lay people on artificial intelligence. It's written by a couple of guys in Canada, faculty members. It's called Prediction Machines. And essentially that's right. I mean, so the question is, where are these machines going to be good at predicting? It's not quite the same as forecasting, because predicting includes looking at an image and predicting whether it's a dog or a cat. By the way, I mean, these technologies, some of them sound, sort of silly, but they're hugely powerful general purpose technologies. Image recognition's one, all in the last 10 years. You just can't have, very smart robots that can't see, and you certainly can't have autonomous vehicles, without this image recognition technology. And it was a complete roadblock in the old version of artificial intelligence, because the old version of artificial intelligence was the coding version. We figure out how we understand language, translate, recognize images, and then once we figured that all out, then we can tell the machines how to do it, even if it's a bit complicated. And the problem was that we couldn't figure out how we did it. It's that simple. Everybody on this call can recognize a chair. When you see it, you don't even think about it. But ask yourself, but there's an uncountable number of versions of chairs, right? So just to ask yourself the question, pick up a pencil and a piece of paper and start writing the code that tells the machine what a chair is and when it's a chair and not a desk or a bureau or a rug. And you'll fail. You just can't do it. There'll always be exceptions. But the machines learn because they just detect patterns. Machines learn to recognize images even if they don't know the name. Because in order to know the name, they have to it has to be labeled, right? The training data set has to have a label attached to it. But they can sort out, images one from another without names. They'll give them their own names and stuff like that. Anyway, I'm blathering on. But the bottom line is really powerful. Kai-Fu Lee is very interesting on this. He was trying to explain, Kai-Fu wrote an influential book, about the AI superpowers, which are at the moment primarily China and the United States. And he said, was trying to explain, artificial intelligence, this version of artificial intelligence, the one that's, so powerful now. He said, we all remember spreadsheets. Some of us even remember when they arrived, right? And so spreadsheets seem miraculous because, you just, instead of, kind of recalculating the data, you just entered the formula in a cell. And then they changed the number and the formula, change everything else on the spreadsheet. He said, so that's the old technology. He said, the way to understand artificial intelligence is you give it, sort of 50,000 spreadsheets from a domain like financial statements. And these algorithms will tell you the formula.
Correct. Professor Spence, if you allow me, can I segue a question from here?
Sure.
I just want a very simple thing from you, which is taking off from the Growth Commission and kind of knitting with your talk here, because Growth Commission, obviously, I think we need to, if you have the time, get you to give us a talk on that too sometimes. Right. Because obviously growth is of extreme concern to us. Pakistan is a poor country, per capita income of $1,500, and we are growing at 2% per annum now. Our long run growth has been declining. So having said that, I just want to ask a simple question. Well, not so simple maybe. Digital economy and all these things that we are talking about, it kind of seems to me, and lots of people are talking about it, that perhaps where we are lagging behind is in our institutions that are, changing at the same speed as the digital economy. We are more stodgy in our institutions, and this is becoming more and more visible in the fragmented economy that we are seeing, the politically polarized economy, all the way from the US to the rest of the world. We are also very polarized. But perhaps that's because of the lack of institutions. At the same time, when I look at the growth literature and your Growth Commission and many other areas, one of the key differentiations starting off from North or whatever is that the poor countries have to grow the institutions that will allow them to grow their economies.
Right.
And unfortunately, we've had 70 years of trying to grow institutions in countries like Pakistan. We're one of the first countries to be made independent. And the World Bank has been helping us. All the international donors have been helping us. Lots of money has been put in. But we find our institutions failing more and more, depreciating or getting eroded more and more. I don't think we have any idea how to grow our institutions. Yet the standard economic prescription is make institutions, and we don't know what these institutions are. We don't know how to make them. And I think part of the digital economy also is, are we capable of making the new institutions? So more broadly, a question on institutions for you and growth.
Well, I mean, those are kind of centrally important set of issues. So just to talk about institutions for a second. I mean, so I had to kind of address this question because there was a debate going on even at the time when the Growth Commission was kind of functioning, you know, about institutions, you know, whether you needed them in order to, you know, have growth, or whether you got growth and then the institutions came along later. And so, you know, I thought about that for a while, and I finally decided it's really both, meaning, you know, it's not silly to introduce the notion of institutions, but this notion that, you know, you need them first or you can't get anywhere seemed to me to get not to be quite right. I mean, we had the same discussion of infrastructure, you know, so people would wander into China for the first time and take a look. This is like, let's call it 2008, okay, you know, and they wander in and then take a look at the infrastructure. It's just by then pretty impressive. I mean, we didn't have the high-speed train network and all that, you know, and then they wander into, you know, parts of India and say, well, look at the difference here. And I'd say, now hold up here, right? I mean, India is about 10 years behind China. And the fair comparison is not China's infrastructure now. It's China's infrastructure, you know, 10 or 15 years ago compared to, and, you know, and then it doesn't look so stark. And the way I tried to explain this to students is that development is really a bunch of little steps, and they kind of come in parallel. And so I think you are actually building economic capacity and dynamism in some sense in all the relevant dimensions, including expectations and whatnot. And at the same time, building institutions, you know, that are capable of sort of supporting and sustaining that. And the notion of prerequisites or necessary conditions and stuff isn't very helpful, you know, if that's kind of what's going on. Having said that, a country like Pakistan probably has a potential growth, you know, at that income level of, let's call it 7 or 8%. It's context specific, you know, it depends on history and structure and resources and a bunch of other things. But I mean, in general, you know, the catch-up effects should be pretty strong and so on. So if you're asking, you know, what's really necessary, when you don't have a fully developed set of institutions, you probably are, at least every case I ever looked at was relying on leadership. It wasn't an individual necessarily, but a group who were, by one form or another, it was hard to be scientific about it, kind of decided that the objective was long-term growth, long time horizons, pragmatic, you know, inclusive, all that, you know, as opposed to, I mean, there's a lot of regimes in the world that are doing something else, right? You know, looking after their own region, you know, trying to stay in power, that, you know, and this, by the way, is not confined to developing countries. I mean, you know, it's but development is hard enough that I think success has an element of luck in it. You know, when you get a group of people who are more or less doing the right thing, and even when they don't know how to do it, their intention is to figure it out and keep working at it till they get it right. And so if you look at the history of various places, I mean, you see that, you know, that just happens. I mean, India's development model was vaguely Soviet for a while. That didn't work very well. China's, strategy probably changed in a crisis-like way at the end of Mao's rule, because the economy was performing pretty badly. And they had assets. They'd invested in education. Literacy rates were pretty high. They just kind of had the wrong economic model. And nobody knew what the right one was, but they decided they'd sort of go figure it out. And I tell the students, I say, this isn't a very good answer because there's no easy way to sort of make this seem automatic. And you never know whether an individual is critical or important. But I tell the students, so let me tell you about Deng Xiaoping. He was a highly intelligent peasant who worked with Mao, Chairman Mao. And then in the Cultural Revolution, he was sent off like almost everybody else to a tractor factory. He was a little guy. He probably could have gotten sick and died, but he didn't. Zhou Enlai kind of liked him, thought he was smart, so made sure he kind of got back. Then the Gang of Four took over. They didn't last very long, but they got rid of him again. And then sort of he comes back and then is pretty good at political maneuvering and eventually, ends up in a position of power and decides to change the development model. And they say, well, that's interesting. And I say, so what fraction of that story makes it sound inevitable to you? That China would dramatically change its development strategy, in 1978. And they kind of go, Right. So, I think that I'm trying to be honest, but I think that's part of the answer. There's a group of people who, have at heart the kind of public interest in the sense that you and I mean it.
Sure.
And then, figure out a way to start implementing that, but they have to be somewhere near in a position of power to get started at it.
But then the way I hear you, it seems that development should be treated more as a learning system and more as a bit of a risk-taking and experimentation system, because the Chinese seem to have followed that. They seem to have followed willy-nilly an experimentation and risk-taking system. They take initiatives, some of them fail, some of them succeed, they keep moving on. Whereas in our part of the world, I don't want to get into it to keep you, but in our part of the world, what's happening is we seem to be too stuck in following the advice from the international architecture, and we are trying to build this and build that, and not enough risk-taking. We are told by the IMF to, stabilize the economy and don't take any risks. So in a sense, our learning by doing process is severely retarded. And I don't know whether that means anything or not, but perhaps if you have the time at some point, we should get you in for a growth lecture so that we can learn from you on the growth situation.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying, Nadeem. No, I'd be delighted to do that. I think your characterization of, how do I say it? Successful development, or programs over a long period of time definitely have this sort of experimental, pragmatic, navigational kind of characteristic, basically because A, there's no single model that works. B, every case is idiosyncratic in important dimensions that matter. And if you think about economics, almost all models are equilibrium. And if you think of development as shifting the equilibrium from one thing to the next, or a transition economy, which is the way the Chinese describe it, it's just not the same thing. And so the conceptual weapons you've got available to you to kind of help aren't useless, but they're not in any sense complete. I describe this in the book as navigating with incomplete charts. It's not no charts, it's not like, Vasco da Gama trying to figure out whether there's an edge to the earth or something, but I have a friend with whom I worked. He was World Bank for most of his life, managed to stay out of Washington, and he and I and some others were trying to help out in China, bring international perspectives, at the time the 12th five-year plan was being put together. and this chap was one of the three people that went to China with the World Bank, along with McNamara, who was the president and a very well-known German guy in finance. And they went at Deng Xiaoping's request. This is in the early to mid 1980s. And basically, what Deng Xiaoping said was, I mean, this is stylized, so don't take it literally, but we know you're a bank, but that's not really, we don't really want money. But what we do want is we don't know how to manage a market economy, some version of a market economy. I mean, and so we'd like help with that. And so that was the first request of the World Bank. It was about knowledge transfer. Only in this case, it was about knowledge transfer with respect to policy. And so what happened is, but to your point, Nadim, but they knew that, that would be helpful, but that it wouldn't, they couldn't just take it literally. So if you take an economy that's been centrally planned, and then you go ask a macroeconomist, when an economy is overheating, in the West, an economy is overheating, what do? That person will say the central bank will raise interest rates.
Yeah. But
when the Chinese said to themselves, geez, 3 years into a market economy that's, institutionally underdeveloped in every dimension you can think of, regulatory, market institutions, et cetera. If you sort of started to get inflation and you raised the interest rate, nobody'd care, right? Because they're not reacting, to those price signals yet. 20 years later, that'll probably work. But so that's just a kind of colorful way of saying that you're dealing with, a transition in which these things that we learn in school or university that are, we think are kind of always there aren't. And so I think that the right mindset. I'll let you go, but the last thing, when I was doing the Growth Commission work, I went to different parts of the world, and I discovered they had very different attitudes toward these things. So I won't name specific places or people, but I went to Latin America, and I had the feeling they were very attached to sort of what I or they called getting the policies right. And I said to myself, is that really an objective? I mean, getting the policies right, or is the objective growth? And we'll figure out how to get there as we kind of go along. So I said, which of these is the right approach? Set the objectives, and then it'd muck around until you seem to be making progress toward them, or get the policies right, and whatever growth emerges from getting the policies right is the right rate of growth. And in Latin America, the normal answer was the second, always. Yeah. Whereas if you ask that question in China, we'd always get some version of the first. I mean, there's probably some combination in the middle here, but I think the damage that comes from, developed countries' approaches, both in developed countries and then when translated to emerging economies, is this mixing up policies and even market institutions with objectives, right? I mean, we now have really influential authors like Michael Sandel, who says, look, markets do fine in certain circumstances, and they do a disastrous job in other circumstances because they take us in a direction that's directly counter to our values. And so, I think that the underappreciated importance of the kind of the experimental mindset is a continuing challenge.
Thank you very much, Michael. This has been wonderful, and we'll take you up on your offer if you can. My request, if you agree, we'll get you to a growth lecture, because this is going to be extremely important for us. What we are trying to do here is really It's becoming more and more expensive for our kids to go and study overseas. I'm trying to open a window here. Zoom has been a great discovery, I must confess. Pre-COVID, I kicked myself. Why didn't I discover Zoom? But COVID forced me to discover Zoom, and now I'm married to it. I virtually live on Zoom, and it allows us to put people like you in our drawing room, in our living room, because quite frankly, previously we had to beg and try and find dates, and we couldn't get people like you. So this has been really wonderful. It's an honor. It's absolutely great. And we shall, inshallah, try and get you again. And when COVID subsides, maybe we can even physically show you Pakistan. It's got a lot to offer. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Spence. It's been a wonderful discussion. I think everybody in Pakistan will enjoy it and talk about it for the next week. Thank you. Bye.
Pleasure being with you. I'll look forward to the next time, Nadeem. Okay?
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.